How's it going, YouTube? It's Barrett here. I wanted to take a little bit of time before we got into the frame assembly videos to kind of describe what's going on, to describe the design of my frame, to kind of give a layout for how the process is going to go for putting the frame up and why it has to go that way. So, this right here is the frame for the house as designed in my CAD program. This is Fusion 360, and it looks like a house. So I've got the main structure here. I've got my porch wrapping around the front, and I've got a nice little entryway over here in the front with some truss work on that. I've got a nice roof profile here with a 9/12 or 9-pitch roof with a dormer. That's a 5-pitch roof here. Some dormer posts and beams, right? A second floor loft here with the floor joists, and in the back we've got space for a mechanical room. Remember that we're doing this all slab on grade, so I don't have a basement, so all of my mechanicals have to go into a place, my water heater and filtration if I need it, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, this is kind of, in summary, what the house should look like when it's all done. Let's talk about the design of my frame. I think typically you'll find kind of two major flavors when talking about a timber frame. One would be kind of an integral bent design. So if give me a moment to hide some stuff here. Alright, so if I take the house here in profile, right, I have, let's see, how about this? So if we take this house in profile, if I built this frame with this all rigidly attached with just a collar tie, so if this extended out to here and integrated into these rafters and down for collar tie posts, and I had a tie beam here in these sections. This would kind of be like a traditional bent design. I think in a lot of modern timber frames you see this. They look nice. They go up pretty easy. They're fantastic structures. The issue here is these are all structural components in that case. So the rafters are structural. So this would be a principal rafter. The collar tie, these would be structural and all have to tie together. And this tie beam here then becomes very important and structural, and I'll go through that here in just a second. And there's a few challenges with this design. One is that these principal rafters would have to be one piece, and this tie beam here would have to be one piece. These rafters have to be one piece to support the lateral load from the roof. They would take all of that, which is why you typically have a collar tie in these designs, and posts in some fashion or braces to support load from the roof pushing down into the structure. So it supports these from flexing. Also, right, just gravity, weight pushing down on the peak would want to push out on these posts here. So right, if these are all one piece and I'm pushing down on top of the roof, it's going to push out here in this direction on both sides, which means that this tie beam here becomes a construction member that's in a tension mode, which is kind of undesirable. It makes the joinery very challenging. It has to be locked together, and more importantly, this then has to be like a single piece. It's very difficult to make this multiple pieces, all with tension joinery, all that are not going to fail over time. So typically when you're building a house with that style, the width in this direction on this plane here becomes the limiting factor, right? Because you might be able to find a 20 or 30 foot long piece of timber that will support this, but that could be as long or as wide as this could ever be, because you really want this to be one piece. And then you have posts here just to support the weight in the middle. So your frame then becomes limited by how long of a piece you can find in structural timber for the tie beam, and how long of a structural piece you can find for the rafters. And then with that design, right, you would have multiple of those assemblies. They're called bents, and you would put up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however long, and you would put tying members between those that really are just there to hold those bents together structurally, so they're going to be all braced together to keep things from like falling over. But once you get past assembly of these bents, it's pretty straightforward and easy, and everything just is built to tie it together in that orientation. So when you do that design, most of these connections are like dovetailed or in some fashion placed so that the things can't separate, right? And like this end piece couldn't just fall over sometime down the road. The other style, and it's the style that I chose to go with personally, I like it a lot. It's very visually pleasing to me. I like the geometry of it. I like the sturdiness of it. And that is the principal purlin design. So if I get rid of my roof component, right, we have these three very distinct structures here. The first floor, the queen assembly, and the king assembly. And you could really do this forever. You can just keep stacking these pieces on top of each other. I say forever. You couldn't really, I mean, you could build a skyscraper with it, but there's a lot of other things that would have to go into it. But it's happened, right? Very large structures in medieval Europe were timber framed, and they were tall, large structures. But the principal purlin design is all integrated together, and the strength of the frame is entirely in this assembly that you're seeing here. And the rafters, when I put those on top, really just become beams at an angle. So if I put the roof components back on, right, these, let's see, dormer. These rafters, right, this one sets on top of this principal purlin, and then these sit on top of this principal purlin, and then these sit on top of this principal purlin or this dormer beam, and they're just resting there. Because this assembly is rigid, there's no way for this peak to push down, right? The peak pushes onto this beam, pushes onto this post, pushes onto this beam, which then transfers its forces down onto this beam, and then into this post, and then to the ground. So all of the force is transferred directly into the ground, and none of the force is transferred out into these girts out here, these principal purlins. So I don't know. It's a very structurally rigid design. It's structurally, I think, a structurally simple design. Yeah, principal purlin. I like it a lot. Most barns, I guess I should say this, right? In today's world, most barns are built this way. but I think these are becoming more and more common in the timber frame world, because I think people do find them pleasing. You can have very tall, open spaces that work, and the joinery is simplified, and it's easier to justify to engineers and such. So, anywho, all that to say that for me, this design choice was more aesthetic than anything. Well, aesthetic plus the orientation of the house and understanding the limitations of my material. Using maple, I would never be able to find a 30-foot long maple large enough and straight enough to make a 30-foot tie beam. Like, the limitations of my material prevented me from doing a integral bent design for this frame. So those are the two factors that led into my choice here. Now for a little bit on design of the house, design of the frame. So there's really kind of two sub-assemblies here, I guess we'll call them, or two separate frames. One of them being the porch. So if I take away the porch stuff here, or I highlight it, all right, there's a ledger board here that these rafters all sit on. So this frame is more or less separate from the main structure of the house. That way I can completely enclose this with zip board, and I can tape it and I can seal it up real nice. The only places where my air barrier will be penetrated or broken is here where this beam interacts with the foyer, and on the back side there's another one where there's a beam that interacts with the mechanical room right here. And those are mortised and tenoned into the structure for strength and rigidity. For the frame, nice anchor points. Overall, it's a pretty simple design. I'm utilizing some splines inside of these posts to tie these beams together. You can see the splines inside. Those will be pegged, and then braces through there. So this should go together pretty easy. And my rafters just set on top of this beam to tie all that together, square and true it up. And all of those set on these piers that'll be concrete with a stone cap, some blocks and a stone cap. So they're 20 by 20, they're 3 foot tall. Then my 8 by 8 posts will set on top of those. If I get rid of the porch, what we're left with is like the remainder of the house. Kind of want to show you something cool here before we get into this. I don't know why I've always found this intriguing, but if I get rid of everything except for the braces, it's kind of cool, right? Because if you pay attention, you can kind of see where the structure of the house is still, even though I've taken away all the main beams and posts. It's kind of interesting to me, anyway. And then if I get rid of those and I start bringing back the house, I've got a bunch of different assemblies. So I've got everything that would be on the first floor, right? So I've got this grid work. Each of these are 10 foot by 10 foot squares, right? And I've got beams that span across the top and connect each of these posts in this orientation. We'll call this the x-axis that would go, along this beam here. And those are all mortised and tenoned into these central posts all the way around. And then I've got these, which are called summer beams. They're splined. They're designed to go into place afterwards, so they're not mortised and tenon. Once these sections are standing, these will drop in. And I've got these what are called principal purlins, and they're tying this structure together in this orientation, and they are mortised and tenoned and scarfed for length. These are, you know, kind of effectively making a longer timber than I could find naturally. On top of the first floor, we've got what's called the queen assembly. So a secondary set of timber frame. So if I kind of hide the first floor, right, these posts set on top of these beams here, if I take away the first floor, it's a pretty simple square structure. I've got these posts with these tie beams, and then I've got another set of principal purlins on top here, also scarfed and tied together. And then sitting on top of my queen assembly, I've got the king assembly. So the king sets on top of these tie beams here, and if I get rid of the queen assembly, I've got my ridge beam, again scarfed to add length, and these little king posts here. And if I put the queen on top of the king, or the queen under the king, and the first floor under the queen, right, and I add some braces back in there, you can see that these are all rigidly tied together. So for assembly, at the beginning of this whole process, it's important to note that as of yet, I have not test fit any of this joinery. I've not made sure that the mortise and tenons fit for any of these parts. I've used gauges and templates and test pieces to try to make sure that all these are consistently sized, so they should all fit pretty well. But I might need to do some cleanup on all the mortise and tenons, just based on, you know, wood movement or various factors, right? It's wood, it's a natural product, it's not consistent, not the same. Differences between me or my father-in-law's work would be evident in our tolerances, so there's going to be a little bit of fine-tuning. The braces haven't been tested. The whole system hasn't been set for plumb, for square, or anything like that. So we kind of have to enter this whole process first with pre-assembly and test fitting everything, labeling stuff for the braces, making sure that, you know, when we know a brace is good here between, you know, this scarfed section and this king post, that when we put it back together it goes in the same place so that it's square and plumb in its final home. So the plan is to start from a top to bottom approach, and I'll kind of get to why we chose that at the end. Meaning we're going to start here with the queen assembly. We'll test fit and square and plumb everything on the king assembly, and then we'll set that aside. And then we'll pull the queen assembly out and we'll test fit, square and plumb everything there, label it all, and then we'll set it aside. And then we'll do the first floor assembly, right? We'll test fit and we'll square, and on the first floor, as we test fit and square, after we get to a certain point, then we'll start raising the frame, because that's where we'll be at the ground, and then we'll be able to just basically put this thing together from there, and it should go pretty quick if we've done our job right. At this point it should go very fast when we get to the raising part. So if I take away the first floor in the king assembly, right, we would test fit these braces to these beams. We would assemble this all as one piece, and then we can set the king is pretty easy because there really isn't like an X axis, there really is only a Y axis, right? So that's only one test fit, and then we can put that one away. The queen assembly gets a little more tricky. So as I mentioned, we'll call the x-axis from this side to this side. So along this beam's path is x, and then y would be along like the purlin path. So first we would assemble this purlin, attach these 3 posts, put in the braces, verify everything square, everything plumb, and then we can set this aside. And then we'll do the same with this side over here. These 3 posts, braces, square, plumb, set that aside. Then we can take these 3 components here, these 2 posts and the y-axis, this beam, we could set that together with the braces installed, square them, plumb, make sure everything's good. And at this point, with the equipment that we have, we can move this as one assembly, one sub-assembly. So we can actually pin this together. In our case, we'll actually take the king post here with its associated braces, right? We'll make sure that's all square, plumb and true. And then we're going to pin that together. So these 3 pieces here with their braces would get pinned together and set aside. And we would do that 3 times. And then the queen assembly would be all assembled and part of the king assembly. And then once that's done, we can get to the first floor, right? So if I make that visible, right, we would do the same thing. We would move in the X direction first along this path, and we would assemble these 3 posts with this beam, install the braces, make sure it's all square and plumb, and then we would just work our way down, and we'd set that aside. And then we would work our way down the line, this post, summer beam, post, summer beam, square, true, set it aside. Post, summer beam, that's not the right one. Post, summer beam, post. You get the picture. Summer beam, set that aside. Post, purlin, post, purlin, post, square, set that aside. Then we can start here. And this is where, before we get started with this, we'd have to set down the sill timbers. So sill plate timbers are all black locust, and the frame is integral, right? So these little squares here are mortise pockets and tenons on the bottom of our main first floor posts. I'll tie into that. Mechanical room here, those are all tenoned into mortise pockets here on this sill timber. So all this will have to get assembled, and then we can get our our first floor. We would test fit these 4 posts, these 3 beams, make sure we're all square and plumb, and then we can raise this. So we can raise this one frame section and move on to the next. And in our case, we would move to this back wall. It made the most sense to us to do it that way because it leaves this whole footprint open while we square and do the work here. Once that's all set, we raise it, brace it, and pin it all together. And then the last thing, again, this whole footprint would be open, would be to do these components here, and we would then raise this. And at that point, once those 3 rows are raised, we can attach the kind of tying structure here, as in these purlins here. and these summer beams. With all of their associated braces, at that point, this is a very rigid structure, and we can build off of that. It'll be all tied and integrated together. This is, completely standalone. No roof would be tied to it, but this is very much a strong structure. And we can work on the mechanical room and the entryway later, because these tie in simply after the fact. So we can work on the main structure first. Once that's done, we can take these assemblies that we built for the queen and we can set them on top of the first floor. It just stacks on there, these arches, and then we would install these purlins, and then we would install the king post, right? And again, once the braces are installed, this is now a very rigid structure. And we can do everything now independent. We can rig off of this, we can tie off to this, we can yank and pull on this all day long, and it's not going to go anywhere. And then we would work to install the dormer sections. So it's kind of busy right here. I'm going to do this a little independent of the main frame for a moment. Right, so the dormer assembly consists of 4 components. This is like the outer wall section. It rests on top of the first floor principal purlin and will support the dormer rafters. So we have dormer posts, a dormer beam, and space for windows here. We have, I call it a mid-span. I'm not sure if that's what everybody else would call it, but a mid-span section here. And all this is here for is to carry the middle part of these rafters. If I put the roof components up, right, the rafters are 2 pieces. So I have one here that ties from this main dormer section to the midspan, and then a smaller rafter that goes from the midspan up to the king assembly or the peak. And I need the midspan because if you look at my 9-pitch roof, right, these go from the principal purlin on the first floor to the principal purlin on the queen assembly, right there and right there. So these sections here just help to make the dormer assembly stand out from the main 9-pitch roof section. So if I do king assembly, right, that would make the top and rafters go doop doop doop, and then put in the rest that would support the 9-pitch down this way. Once we're all done here, we can install the rafters, and I'll call them spreaders, or they're not principal, they're just purlins. But if I put my roof components on, there are these pieces that go in between the rafters. Just give support to the rafters, give a little bit of support to the roof, but really they just help maintain spacing and to some extent prevent twisting and warping of these bigger timbers over the course of their life as they kind of dry out in season.